Welcome. You're watching Muslim Network TV, whether through satellite or OTT devices or your own mobile phone or YouTube. Uh, Today, I have a special guest. Nuclear bomb is probably the worst invention of humanity. To the level that people who invented, they actually went out against that and established organization uh, to oppose its usage and dismantling of that weapon and all that. I just happened to be sitting in a library for at least 4 years where the little atomic bomb was exploded for human being to learn uh, controlled chain reaction. But we have today a person uh, whose parents are victims of the nuclear bomb in Japan. We have with us a person who have studied that she is a nuclear ethicist and a professor at the Department of Religious Studies at the DePaul University in Chicago. Professor Yuki Miyamoto, welcome to Muslim Network TV.
Thank you for having me.
Well, where is your mom today?
Oh, unfortunately, she is not with us anymore. She passed away in 2001.
So, how much time did you spend with her?
Well, she was she was 6 years old at the time of the bombing, but she didn't tell me what happened or her experiences. And so I vaguely knew that she experienced the atomic bombing, but I was never brought it up. And she was often sick in her 30s, and I don't know anything about her early 20s or teens, but when I was growing up in Hiroshima, in her 30s, she had Meniere disease, and in her 40s, her blood organ fails to produce healthy blood cells, which often happens when you are exposed to radiation. So she had to get blood booster shots every other week. And then in her 50s, she had cancer and she passed away at the age of 62.
When did I have been to Hiroshima bombing and structure and all that, and the tragedy took life of so many people right away, and many people continue to suffer and passed away prematurely. And she passed away when she was 60-year-old, despite the fact that Japan has life expectancy, I think, close to 80.
Hmm. Over 80, especially for women.
Yes. So, so,
84.
so tell us, so when she was finally able to share with you where she was when atomic bomb exploded over Hiroshima?
Thank you for asking, because part of the reasons that she didn't tell me her experiences is, well, apparently revisiting her experiences is perhaps traumatic. She probably doesn't want to go through her memory again by revisiting, by telling me the stories. But at the same time, those who went through the atomic bombing, those who were exposed to radiation, they were discriminated against by the fellow Japanese citizens, and especially children, even children. Um, I'm kind of a younger generation of among the daughters and sons of the atomic victims, the children of the atomic victims. But older generation of the children of the atomic bomb victims, they had some discrimination, like my cousins. And so that was part of the reasons that she didn't tell me her experiences, but I was able to learn where she was and what happened very briefly from my aunt. And my mother's house was a mile away from the hypocenter, so that's where she was. However, my aunt told me there most likely she was actually a little closer to the hypocenter. She must have been at the elementary school, which is slightly closer to a mile away from the hypocenter where hundreds kids were killed by the bombing. But somehow she didn't have any external injuries and she seemed to have survived that moment.
Tell us, so what was for the purpose of audience establishing, how many people it is estimated who died immediately and who died in the following years?
Right. Unfortunately, we don't have the immediate numbers, and partly because the at the hypocenter, the temperature rose to 6,000 to 9,000 Fahrenheit, which is equivalent to the surface of the sun. So everything, so if you go to, or when you go to the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park, you would see the shadow imprinted on the stone steps.
I have seen that.
Oh, okay. Well, that tells us that someone was sitting there in the morning of August 6th, and that was supposedly the bank entrance. But because of this, because when the bomb exploded, it emits the flash. So the flash printed this person's shadow on the stone steps, but the body itself, because of this high temperature, the surface of the sun, so the body just got evaporated immediately. So that's and only left the shadow. So that was what happened, and because of this high temperature, the fire breaks out automatically, and you might have seen those kids who are school children who are out there. Their clothes caught fire and their skin melted, their clothes also burnt and burnt into the skin got melted. And so we have some records or photographs of those school kids. So again, we do not have even estimation of the numbers who were killed by the bomb, and especially because of acute radiation sickness as well as more long-term radiation sickness. And currently, the city of Hiroshima adopted this number, 140,000 death as a death toll, but this is a number by the end of 1945. So the bomb was exploded, bomb was dropped in August, but then after that, people thought that they had survived. Like my grandfather, he was actually on his way from the hospital. He was a doctor from the hospital to come to home. And on his way home, he witnessed the bombing. And he seemed, this is what my aunt told me, he seemed fine. But then 2 weeks later, he passed away from acute radiation sickness. So I've never met him. But so 2 weeks later, people are still dying. A month later, 2 months later, people were still dying. So that was why this number was estimated by the end of 1945. And to this day, the number rose up to 200,000 in Hiroshima.
Mm-hmm. Share with me how many members of the family, like grandfather, how many members of your extended family passed away or become victims because of radiation?
My mother's family, her house is a mile away from the hypocenter. So my mother's family were affected. which includes my grandfather, although he was not at home. As I mentioned, he was coming home at the time of the bombing. And then my grandmother, who died from the lung cancer 40 years after, or yeah, almost 40 years after the bombing. And then they had three sisters, older sister, my mother, and the younger sister. And so far, two sisters are still with us, which is great. Only my mom passed away already, like almost 20 years ago. But this older sister's daughter, who were born after the bombing, one of them, two daughters, my aunt had two daughters, which are my cousins. One of them actually had some, even though they were born after the bombing in the 50s, she had self-immune system disorder in her 30s and almost bedridden for 20 years and passed away in her 50s. And I've been growing up in Hiroshima, I've been hearing lots of the children of those people who witnessed, who were sufferer of the bombing. They also suffer from physical illness. But as I mentioned briefly, they also received some discrimination against.
Let's talk about the discrimination. I thought people will be very sympathetic that these people suffered through all of this, and why there was a discrimination.
Yes, that's a good question. I hope that people would have been more sympathetic to the survivors, partly because of some misinformation or ignorance. Because even after the bombing, those who thought they had survived the bombing, they were dying from radiation sickness. So that was kind of fear and enigmatic to people, and give some wrong idea that those people who were exposed to radiation, they can die suddenly. And especially that is severe for women, because society tend to think, and still now tend to think, that if they are not able to bear children, or if they give birth to children who are not healthy, those issues are often put on women's shoulders. So people who want families, or who thinks that handing down the family name, which is a big thing in East Asia, handing down the family name, they want healthy kids. So don't even think about marrying those women, is one of the prejudices there.
Mm-hmm.
So people think
that's why my mother was protective of information.
I'm sorry?
And that's the reason perhaps your mom was protective of that information, that she's a victim and things of this nature.
Yes, I think so. I have an older brother. He had a little bit more information about my mother, but my mom never told me about her experience. And yes, exactly. I think she wanted to protect me from any that sort of discriminatory treatment or behaviors.
Now, the bomb which they put on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was tiny in terms of its power, and it has devastating impact of immediately killing so many people, and eventually more than 200,000 people. The number could be even more. These are probably population number. They have no idea. There may be other people visiting the marketplace from villages and all that. So these are just estimate. But now it seems there are bombs which are many-fold bigger, and there are many, many more, high potency power bombs. So, do you have any idea how much nuclear bombs are now, how powerful they are, and how many they are, and how widespread they are?
Oh, thank you. I should have known the exact numbers, but actually, the number wise, it's decreasing. And at one point we had 18,000 nuclear weapons, but now I think it went down to 6,000 or something along that line. So number-wise, we have reduced, which sounds like a good sign. However, I must say that, and also the size-wise, when hydrogen bomb was invented by the United States in 1951 and also followed by the Soviet Union, those hydrogen bombs were so big that the US couldn't test those bombs on the mainland. So they went to the Marshall Islands as if that is okay. So the biggest bombs were tested in the 50s. And those tests went on to 90s and still going on. However, now what is going on is those bombs were actually not as big as those old days, but it's more accurate and more effective. And that's what is happening. So number-wise, they're small, but still they can destroy the Earth, entire Earth, many times. So we don't need those many. Well, we don't need it at all, but we don't need 6,000 either, even though it has shrunk from the heyday.
So number is not as high as it used to be, but potentially the capacity to kill and destroy the Earth is far higher at this moment. Now, what is the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists is saying about what type of risk does the humanity and the Earth has at this moment?
Right. Yes, I would like to talk about, some scientists, politicians talk about potential danger of nuclear war. And yes, there are some dangers, but I would like to talk about the nuclear tests already have been done. The US alone, the US has conducted 1,032 nuclear tests. And over 900 of them were done in Nevada test site, but 67 of them, which sounds small compared to 1,032, but it's bizarre to say small, when we are talking about nuclear tests. But 67 nuclear tests, which took place at the Marshall Islands, that were those bigger bombs, hydrogen bombs. And so people had to evacuate. And the Marshall Islands back then in the 50s and in the 40s and 50s, it was a territory of the United States. And so they are the U.S. nationals, but not a citizen. They don't have a vote to choose the president or to send the representatives to vote some kind of policies. So those territories were used as the nuclear test site, and 67 bombs, and people had to evacuate, and they returned. But of course, those radioactive nuclei live very long. Like one of them, plutonium, which half-life is 24,000 years. So of course, those people who came back several years after the tests, they started falling ill. So they had to re-evacuate. And so there are some diaspora communities in Hawaii or on West Coast, or as close to, I'm in Chicago, so as close to Iowa. So those Marshall Islanders. So for them, the nuclear war had already happened to their homeland. And still they are having this aftermath. And the same as the downwinders, which refers to those people who are downwind of the nuclear test sites or nuclear production sites. And there are so many nuclear production sites in the United States, especially during the Cold War era. Hanford, Washington State, and Hanford in Washington State, and of course nuclear test sites in Nevada, New Mexico, Los Alamos, Oak Ridge in Tennessee, and there are more laboratories throughout in the United States. So, for example, those downwinders living in Utah, they were finally compensated. Well, half of Utah, because only the southern part of the state of Utah, if you are there at the time of the bombing, you receive the compensation, which was implemented in 1990. The name is RECA, which is Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. But it was in 1990, but nuclear tests had been done already over 900 times. And for them, they are still receiving compensation. This law is still effective. Although it needs to be expanded, the time-wise and also region-wise. So for them, I would say the nuclear war already took place in their land. So what I want to say is that nuclear bombs are not for protection. Nuclear deterrence theory would say because we have nuclear weapons, no one would attack us. So they are protecting us. And this is a very prevalent theory. However, having nuclear weapons from its production or uranium mining through assembling, enriching, assembling, and even disintegrating it, disassembling it, always people suffer from radiation exposure. So given that, having nuclear weapons is not about protecting us. It's about destroying certain people's lives, like our own lives and the environment.
So, Professor Miyamoto, you had a personal knowledge of the suffering because your mother was from Hiroshima, and she herself was a victim, and double victim because she cannot share that with people for the sake of her children. And you added a new dimension to the conversation that whenever we do the testing, there are human victims of that nuclear bomb, which is ongoing perhaps in many areas. China has conducted those nuclear tests in Xinjiang, which is an ethnic minority. And there are not probably much studies about, much less the compensation of what happened to those people. And India has done it, and Pakistan has done it, and Israel, and many, many countries in this. So what is the state of movement to stop these tests as well as eliminate the nuclear weapons?
Thank you. So far, the U.S. has stopped the testing since 1991, although we still have tested kind of computer simulation, subcritical tests at the lab. But we have not exploded the bombs per se. But as I said, a half-life of radioactive nuclides are very long. Half-lives are very long, depending on nuclides. And one of the examples is what I said, plutonium-24, plutonium-239, 24,000 years. So given that, even though currently the nuclear bombs were not being exploded, but we are still living in the shadow of those 1,032 tests. That's the US alone. So the Soviet Union did 714. So altogether, almost 2,000 nuclear bombs were exploded on the Earth. And given that, and I think you made a really good point to those minorities, and seems like those minorities or politically underrepresented people's area tends to be the nuclear test sites, like the Marshall Islands or Nevada. And so it is, but I am hoping that the younger generations, as well as us, middle and senior generations, middle age and senior generations, we are more concerned about, we are more aware of those minorities living their lives. And also, we are more aware of the environmental destruction because, I mentioned the Marshall Islands, and there is a Marshall Islands, beautiful, beautiful ocean, right, surrounding those islands. And all of a sudden, there's a concrete dome, which is actually assembling all nuclear waste under this concrete dome, which is about to submerge because of the climate change. And also, radioactive materials are destroying the concrete material, so it's got crack. So this dome, which supposedly contains nuclear waste, is now cracking and leaking, which is definitely the environmental issues. And also, when it comes to the environmental issues, uranium mines in New Mexico or Belgium, used to be Belgian Congo, it's now Republic of Congo, the uranium, the very good quality uranium is found in Congo. So the people are mining uranium, but it's not well protected. Those people, miners, are not well protected from radiation from uranium, and uranium is spilled over. So that's another environmental issues. So I would like to bring the this nuclear issues are not just in the past, Cold War legacy, but it's still very much relevant to our lives. It's about environmental issues. It's about equity issues, those minorities issues, but also gender issues. There is a UN resolution, which is the Treaty of Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which came into effect in 2021, and the US hasn't signed. Neither has Japan. But this treaty says radiation seems to affect women and girls more so than their counterparts. So it's a gender issue. And it's also definitely economic issues. How much money we have spent for the test, but still today, for example, in the city of Chicago, a resident is paying $500 million to maintain the nuclear weapons. And meantime, we have food desert in the city, and also, the public schools are struggling for the funding. We could have used the money to education, to welfare of the people. So it's economic issues. So race, environment, economic issues, which are very much our everyday concerns. So I would like to bring this nuclear issues sometimes discussed above. This is definitely an international issues, but it's not necessarily cut off from our everyday life. So I would like to bring it to our concerns.
Well, Professor Miyamoto, thank you so much for your time. I hope you stay healthy and productive and continue to work on educating people about the danger of nuclear warfare and even testing. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
You're watching Muslim Network TV on Galaxy 19 satellite, as well as Apple TV, Amazon Fire TV, Roku TV, Samsung TV, or you can download our app if you're not already watching on your phone, iPhone or Android. Just type Muslim Network TV or watch us on YouTube and subscribe. Thank you so much.